God, thank you for another evening to rally together, to worship you, to be encouraged, to be challenged, to smile, to laugh, to consider. And God, where there are areas in our lives where change is needed, correction is needed, would you bring about the best way you do, Lord? Would you bring about conviction, that we would be aware of these things in our life that is not what you desire, and that we would respond with repentance and ask for forgiveness and receive your life and joy in return. So correct where correction is needed. And also, Lord, in areas of our lives where we are feeling beat up, would you encourage us? Would you affirm us? Would you comfort us? And so tonight, would the ink on the pages in front of us or the pixels on the screen in front of us, would it jump off and grip our hearts for your kingdom's sake, that we would walk in the fullness of the men and women you created us to be? We love you and we trust you, Jesus. In your holy name, amen. I know for some of us, trying to think about last weekend feels like it was 2 years ago, 3, right? And you guys feel like that? Like, what happened last weekend, right? Well, last weekend for us as a nation, it was a holiday weekend. We refer to it as Memorial Day. Now, some of you guys starting to remember that a little bit this last weekend, right? Our nation decided some time ago, I don't have the historical facts on this, that we were going to take a day to stop and remember. The ideal is that we would stop and remember the many men and women who sacrificed their lives so that we might be able to live in the country that we live in, that we might be able to abide and engage with many of the freedoms that we have. We were calling as a nation for a day to remember. There are 2 words that are often associated with this day and days like this. I became privy to them when I was in college in a tragedy sort of way. 9/11, some of you guys have read about it. Some of you guys are old enough to have lived through it. There's 2 words that are often associated with events in life and in history to encourage us to remember these things. These 2 words are never forget. Right? Maybe you used it in a hashtag this last weekend, or you came across it. A hashtag that says never to forget. And it's a beautiful call and charge for us, but can we be honest for a second? With all due respect to the men and women that have served and lost their lives this last weekend, how many of us kind of did forget? Maybe you woke up that Monday and you realize, oh, is that today? Why is this place not open? Why is my mail not coming? Why did the trash not get? Whatever it is, you did forget, right? Sometimes we do this, and I mean this in the simplest form, in the most practical form of the term. Since Monday even, how many of us have dedicated time this last week to really consider the men and women? Like, I don't mean this we're not going to boo you or anything, but I haven't spent a dedicated amount of time since Monday to consider those that have lost their lives. And with all due respect to the men and women that have, I haven't abided by this never forget hashtag, this never forget umbrella. But I think we all kind of know this. And I'm not giving you Webster's dictionary definition of this, but never forget is more than just a Post-it note. You know what I mean? This idiom, this idea, this call for us to never forget, it's not just a reminder to put on your to-do list, right? It's really a call for us to take something deeper. It's more of a philosophical or even a spiritual call to never forget or to continually take within your being the impact that event X had on a nation, on a people group. It's to consider often the good that should come of such a tragedy. And yet some of us forget. Never forget, I want us to know this tonight. Never forget is biblical before it's political. It's biblical before it's cultural. It's biblical before it's philosophical. I would even say it this way. God had never forget, hashtag, before culture did. Before anyone. This sentiment of not just remembering cognitively, but remembering in your being, it was God's before it was anyone else's. God calls for us, for humanity, to never forget many things. Some of these things are laws, commands, teachings, but often the constant theme through God's entire teaching of never forget is the one thing we are to always remember within our being, not just in our brain, but himself. God calls us to never forget himself. And part of the tragedy or the slippery slope or the consequence is this. When we forget God, we replace worshiping him, adoring him, often with worshiping or adoring ourselves or someone else or something else. And I want to assure you tonight that if or when we do this, if or when we forget God, we can know that that will quickly lead to destruction. Some of that destruction will be in a practical sense, could be in a practical sense, but often that destruction could be in a spiritual, eternal sense. You see, this was the place of God's people in the book of Ezekiel. This is where we're at in history. Ezekiel 16. Ezekiel, who was Ezekiel? Ezekiel was a man of God. Ezekiel was a refugee, actually. Ezekiel was a captive who was taken from his homeland in Israel and taken to a foreign land known as Babylon. Ezekiel was taken at about 25 years old. And all of Ezekiel's upbringing, he was training and learning to become a priest. And biblically, as far as God aligned things, at 30 years old, men could become priests if they were of the priestly lineage and DNA. So for 25 years, Ezekiel's like, I'm doing this. I'm excited. He'd pass by the temple, look at everything, excited. And then at 25, nope, plans change. He's taken captive because of the sins of his country, his nation. God said there's consequences. Ezekiel was taken captive. And so for 5 years, he lived in captivity. I could only assume, wondering, what is the purpose of my life at this point? I had a plan. Everything seems blown up. Now I don't know what to do. Which, newsflash, it's kind of our life as young adults, right? We make a lot of plans, a lot of things happen, and we're wondering, where am I going? What am I doing? Why is this a thing? Whatever it is. So God shows up to Ezekiel at 30 years old. When he was to be commissioned as a priest, he's in a foreign land. There's no temple, nowhere for him to serve as a priest. And God says, hey, I've got a job for you. You're to be a prophet. In Ezekiel, it talks about this term, a watchman. You're to figuratively stand on the wall and now call out to the people that you see, the dangers you see coming. And so this is what Ezekiel was. He was a prophet. He was a man of God that spoke the teachings, the messages of God, the things that were true of God now and the things that could be coming in the future. And where this lines up in history is Ezekiel was kind of a contemporary, lived around the same time as Jeremiah, who's also penned a book in our Bibles, and Daniel also penned a book in our Bibles. And this was about 500 plus years before Jesus, okay? So if you're trying to figure out where is this on the timeline in relationship to Jesus, 500 years before Jesus. And the irony and the beauty of God is this. Israel, the people of God, made some bad choices. And they had a civil war, and they were split up into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And at this point of Ezekiel's writing, the northern kingdom was taken captive. Okay, they were originally taken captive by Assyria and some other wars. Babylon's now the world power. So Israel, the northern kingdom, is living amidst Babylon. The southern kingdom is now called Judah. And they're still existing in their land. They are not abiding by God's laws. They are not worshiping God. We're going to read of some of the things that they were doing. But they're living a rather tragic life, not remembering, forgetting who God is. Okay, spoiler alert, right? And in this time period, Jeremiah, who pens a book in your Bible before Ezekiel, is speaking to this people, Judah. At the same time, God has risen up Ezekiel living in Babylon to speak to the captives, to speak to the refugees in Babylon. Get this, they are both speaking the same messages. No text messages, no Zoom calls, no emails to say, how to go today, what'd you say, this is nothing. Yet God's Spirit is breathing on both of these men to speak the same thing to his people. Jeremiah is warning the southern kingdom, destruction is coming. If you don't change your ways, destruction is coming. Hey, it's better for you to submit to Babylon and just be taken captive than to fight. If you fight, you're going to lose your life. And they weren't listening. Ezekiel's having visions from God. God is meeting with him in these visions. I don't know if they are daydreams, night dreams. I don't know what it was like. But he's having these visions of what's happening in Judah and what's going to happen. And he's preaching these things. He's sharing these things. And this book breaks down this way. If you like to nerd out a little bit, the first 4 chapters of Ezekiel are really Ezekiel's calling into this ministry. From chapters 5 through 24, we're only going to look at such a sliver, such a small part of this, but chapters 5 through 24 is God speaking his judgment on Jerusalem. Why you're going to go into captivity, what's going on, why you're sinful. And then chapters 25 through 32, God's going to speak. We're going to touch on this next week. Landon's going to teach on it. But God is going to speak to the other nations, the pagan nations. And he's going to let them know, guess what? You're not getting away with anything. I know I'm disciplining my kids, but it's coming for you too. And then the latter portion of the book, 33 through 48, is really hope. Hope for Israel to be restored, Jerusalem to be restored, and even many believe, prophetic, yet to take place, end times prophecy. But I want us to see tonight, again, just a small piece of the pie, what it looks like when we do forget. It's a portion, such a small portion of the judgment on Jerusalem for the way they were acting and why God was going to judge them. If you really want a bigger picture, you have to do more reading, or we could dialogue it in and out later. But it's chapters 5 through 24 if you want to see the bigger picture. But this is where we're at. Ezekiel chapter 16. We're not going to read it, but verses 1 through 14, God is speaking of his love for Israel. God is speaking of how he saw these people as a forgotten people, and he took them in. He cared for them. He nursed them back to life. He gave them a beautiful life. He sums it up this way. Look at 16 verse 14. Your fame, God built up Israel, and they became like a world powerhouse. Under the reign of Solomon, I'm giving you some history, some nerdy stuff here. Under the reign of Solomon, how many of you guys have heard the name of Solomon, King Solomon? You don't even have to believe in God to recognize him as a historical figure. He is often known as one of the most wise people to ever walk the face of this earth. I took a field trip, not on my own, with my kids. It wasn't creepy, but we went to Sacramento recently, and they referenced Solomon on our tour of the Capitol, talking about wisdom. And throughout our Capitol, there's these little hidden owls. I don't know, any of you guys ever took that field trip? There's these little owls hidden around our Capitol, kind of like hidden Mickeys at Disneyland, I guess. And these owls are to represent wisdom, that our states leaders, please God, help our states leaders, that they would operate with wisdom. It's just a reminder. And they reference Solomon. When Solomon was reigning, there were pagan people that would come to Jerusalem to see what they're all about. How are you doing things? This is amazing. This is incredible. This queen came to visit Solomon. She's not a believer, but she observes all that King Solomon is doing and the wisdom in which he operates, and she acknowledges not her God, but Solomon's God's hand is on Solomon and this region, the city Jerusalem. So God has built them up. Has nothing to do with their own works, but God himself built them up, and their fame goes throughout the land. Look at this. This is how he summarizes 16:14. Your fame went out among the nations because of your beauty, for it was perfect through my splendor, which I had bestowed on you, says the Lord God. Notice God's language. He's saying, my love for you is great. This is amazing. You've done nothing really to earn my love. I've just chosen you. God's language was, it is his grace, his mercy, his splendor shared, his splendor bestowed upon Israel. It wasn't Israel's beauty secrets. They could have a beauty YouTube channel, but really, they did nothing to make themselves as beautiful as they look. It was all God's doing. Now notice what they do with the things that God had done to them, for them, and with them. Reading on in verse 15, chapter 16. But you trusted in your own beauty. Not in God, not in God's hand, not in God's work, not in God's grace, God's mercy. You trusted in your own beauty. You played the harlot. This is going to be Ezekiel's word of the day throughout this chapter. But you played the harlot because of your fame and poured out your harlotry on everyone passing by who would have it. You took some of your garments and adorned multicolored high places for yourself and played the harlot on them. God, to his people, such things should not happen, nor be. They took God's provision, they took God's grace, God's mercy, and they should have responded to him with worship. They should have responded in adoration. They should have responded somewhat humbled and grateful, right? But instead, they took it and they worshiped themselves. They took it and said, look how great I am. Look how beautiful I am. They took it and they created actual places of worship as well. Completely the opposite. Not remembering God, but abandoning God. Look at this, verse 17. You also have taken your beautiful jewelry from my gold, from my silver, which I had given you, and made for yourself male images, and played the harlot with them. This is kind of silly. This might be a pastor joke. Sorry, it's not in my notes, but it's in my brain, so I'm just going to speak it. They took the things of God to make for themselves like amazing things, right? To make for themselves, to be places of worship themselves. There's this old joke of this scientist and God hanging out together. And the scientist is telling God how he's not that impressed with all the things that God has created. And the scientist kind of challenges God to make man. And God says, yeah, I'm up for it. And the scientist says, I bet I can make a better man than you, kid. And God says, yeah, let's go. So God makes man. And he says, all right, scientist, you're up. You're shot. And the scientist bends down, grabs some dirt. And God says, no, find your own dirt. Get your own dirt. No, it doesn't land. Get it? God made the dirt. Okay, anyways. The people of God are taking God's silver, God's gold, which I had given you and made for yourself male images and played the harlot with them. Verse 18. Nathan, note to self, don't share that the next time you teach this. Okay. You took your embroidered garments and covered them. And you set my oil and my incense before them. This is God speaking. The things that I've given to you for your benefit. The things that I've given to you, for you to remember me, for you to worship me, you're using it for foreign worship. My oil, my incense before them. Also my food, which I gave you, the pastry of fine flour, oil, and honey, which I fed you. You set it before them as sweet incense. And so it was, says the Lord. These things that God provided, were to be used in responding in worship to God. And yet they said, great, thank you for this. And they used it to worship other idols, to build other idols, to, in essence, worship themselves. They took everything from God and made everything about themselves. Verse 20. Speaks a little more direct to the rebellious lives they were living and the sin they were engaging in. Verse 20, moreover, you took your sons and your daughters whom you bore to me. First, you dedicated these kids to me. And then you sacrificed to them to be devoured. Were your acts of harlotry a small matter that you have slain my children? I gave you these children. And the supposed people of God were acting in child sacrifice. That's what God's talking about. 21, that you have slain my children and offered them up to them by causing them to pass through the fire. There was this foreign god named Molech. And on one valley of the city of Jerusalem, it's still there today, the Kidron Valley, you could cross over to the Mount of Olives. Some of you guys are familiar with this language that I'm using. And the other side, the other valley, It's really a valley. Practically speaking, it's beautiful now. They're making it nicer, but it used to be where everyone dumped their trash, their garbage. But it also used to be a place of foreign worship. That people would come over there and you'd hear screams all night in the city because it was men and women who were offering their children onto the hands of this god named Moloch that they created. And they would burn a fire in the bottom of Moloch. I don't know what this god was made of, some sort of iron, some sort of metal, until this foreign image was burning hot enough that they would lay their children on top of this God as sacrifice. Now, whether you believe in God or not, you can agree that's a problem. That's not right. So you can only imagine how God himself felt as he gifted these children. And this is what they did. 22, and in all your abominations and acts of harlotry, you can underline this, highlight this for the theme of the night, you did not remember the days of your youth when you were naked and bare, struggling in your blood. You did not remember the things that I have done for you. You did not remember how I pulled you out of death and breathed life into you. You see, Haven, when God says you did not remember, I do not believe he is just lacking a grace on an absent-minded people. Can we be honest for a second? Any absent-minded people here right now? Show of hands. Besides myself, this could be a therapy session. Okay, great. We're all there, okay? Someday, if God really cares for you, he might give you a child who's just as absent-minded as you, just to show you how annoying that is in other people's lives, okay? Or even to himself. But I am an absent-minded person. I have to take notes all the time. My wife has to tell me, this is what I need from the store. Great. I leave, and then I come back before I get out of the driveway. I'm like, can you say that again? I should have written that down. What are the 5 things? Okay, I'm absent-minded. I get that. But God's accusation against this people is not that they just forget once in a while. It's that they chose deliberately to forget. They chose not just to forget, but to abandon God and his call in their life. Israel's lack of remembering was not just like, oh man, I'm so sorry, I totally spaced. Israel's lack of remembering went from, what did you ask me to do again? Really to, I hear what you're saying, and yet I'm choosing to rebel. This is their spirit. This act of rebellion, this act of forgetting, it really begins both for Israel and I believe for you and I when we stop recognizing who God is. When we stop responding in worship, adoration, praise, gratitude, when we stop responding to him in worship for who he is and what he has done in our lives. This attitude of rebellion and forgetting, it's when we stop worshiping, it's then that we slowly compromise our living. It's not an overnight thing. I don't think God's people woke up, went to bed one night and saying, man, isn't God great? And then woke up the next morning and said, you know what? I think we're done with him. No. It's a slow compromise in their living, slowly removing God from the place of worship and replacing him often with themselves, with ourselves, or other things that we've made to say, look how amazing I am. And you know what's interesting? For hundreds of years, God has been warning this people group, and I think even us today, that this could happen. And for hundreds of years, he's been generous to say, this is happening, and if you don't change, consequences are coming. For hundreds of years, he's been willing to extend grace. But as you know, probably in your time as a babysitter or a teacher, or maybe your time as a child, sometimes that grace seems to have an expiration date, right? sometimes it's I've given you as much as I can and something needs to change. This is where God is at with his people. He warned them, not only do you need to change, but I want to take you back to Deuteronomy 8, where I believe he warned them that what they are doing now could be a possibility, and if it is, destruction is coming. Go to Deuteronomy 8. It's an oldie and a goodie for me. I want us to hear the warning that God's people had been given, and I think it's a warning for us too. I think it can be a positive thing. But God's people have been told these things over and over and over again, and I think we need to heed this for ourselves. I'm going to break it into thirds. This is the people of God before they enter into the promised land. Okay, so this is many hundreds of years before Ezekiel. Okay, this is when Moses is in leadership. You guys remember Moses? Maybe seen the movie, right? The old 10 Commandments or the cartoon. You've seen the movie, okay? Moses is in leadership. And they're outside the promised land. And they're about to enter in. And Deuteronomy is really a lot of Moses' last teachings. If you were to listen to any podcast of Moses's, it would be Deuteronomy. That's what you want to dive into, okay? He's in Deuteronomy 8, and he's telling them some things that God has given him. He's warning them. He's preparing them. So he tells them, God through Moses tells them, when you get into the promised land, this is what should happen. Okay, that's the first thing we're going to see. Then he's going to tell them, when you get into the promised land, if you don't play it right, this is what could happen. There's a warning. There's a command, this is what should happen. There's a warning, just a heads up, this is what could happen. Just be aware of this, fight against this. And then he's going to tell them, this is what will happen or what would happen if you don't obey. So this is what should happen. Yay! This is what could happen. This is what will happen if what could happen happens. Did I lose you yet? Okay, hang with me. Deuteronomy chapter 8, jump down to verse 6. This is Moses to the people. This is what should happen when you get in there. Therefore, you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and fear him, to live life in a way that adores God, that honors God. I believe the fear of God is a doorway and a pathway. It's a great place to start, to revere God, to acknowledge God, but it's also where we continue to live as followers of Jesus, okay? So the job is, when you get in there, recall the teachings, the commandments, the messages of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land. I have that underlined in my Bible. It's not them, their works, their efforts that brought them into the land. It's God. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs that flow out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of it whose hills you can dig copper. Verse 10, here's the command, the call, the instruction. When you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Hey team, you're about to go into the land. This is what should happen. Okay, when you get in there, it's gonna be amazing. It's Willy Wonka for adults, okay? It's beautiful. You're gonna have everything you need. And when you get in there, enjoy it. But know this, as you're enjoying it, do not forget who brought you into the land. As you're enjoying it, worship, bless, honor, praise God for all the things he's done, for the ways in which he's brought you to this point, and the way in which he's going to provide for you from here on out. That's what should happen. They're not in the land yet, okay? They're outside. It's like before you go into Disneyland, you give instructions. This is what you're, okay? That's where they're at. They're outside. They're getting the instructions. Then God says to them, but be aware, okay? This is what, it's awesome in there, but this is what could happen. Like if my kids, I've yet to take them to Disneyland. I know I'm a horrible father. Sorry, I just don't have money, but we'll get there someday. But with my kids, I want them to know it's amazing, it's beautiful, okay? But when you get in there, I'm not trying to freak you out. someone might kidnap you. Is that a good way to lead? Should I not lead that way? I just say, hey, listen, stay with mom and dad. It's going to be busy, right? You could get distracted. You could be like, no way. And then you get lost, okay? I don't know why I'm on Disneyland. Forgive me. Scatterbrain. This is what could happen when you get in there. Verse 11. Beware that you, this part's underlined in my Bible, do not forget. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by what? Not keeping his commandments, his teachings, his messages, not applying the things that God has been teaching us all these years in this desert, right? Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, his statutes, which I command you today, lest, this is what could happen, when you have eaten and are full, and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness. This is a beautiful teaching tactic on Moses, by the way, if you haven't caught this already. He's not just saying don't forget all the things that God has done for you. He's reminding them as he's telling them all the things that God has done for them, right? And all that you have multiplied. 14, when your heart is lifted up and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents and scorpions, and thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna. I heard a baby cry for a second. Did you guys hear that? I'm like, is that my kid? Are my kids here? Forgive me, sorry. That was really funny. I mean, mama feeds you, I guess, too, right? That's so silly. Blooper reel. Here we go, 16. Who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know. They didn't know what it was, so they called manna. What is it? We don't know what it is. He fed you with, I kind of think it was either Wheat Thins or Cheez-Its. I don't know why, but it just feels like those things you just can't stop, right? I pop a Wheat Thin, I'm like, give me 10 boxes. Who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and that he might test you to do you good in the end. Don't forget all these things. Why? This is what can happen. Then you will say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. Is this not eerily similar in spirit to the things that we just read in Ezekiel 16? God provides, Israel receives. Instead of responding in worship and adoration, gratitude and thankfulness to God, they take from God and worship themselves. They take from God and make it about themselves. Look at all these things that I've done. Sure, yeah, God helped a little bit. He got me this job. He helped me pay these bills. But man, I've been look at all the things that I'm doing. God, thank you for your time. I'll take it from here. Good luck. If we become so blinded by the provision, Haven, we will definitely lose sight of the provider. We've got to fight against that. And once we lose sight of the true provider, once we cease remembering who God is and all that he's given us, then we begin to fall into this trap of thinking that we are the provider. And therefore, when we are the provider, we find ourselves doing one or both of these things. We either begin worshiping the provision and or worshiping the provider as well, ourselves. The problem is not the provision. The problem is our vision, our perspective. If not checked repeatedly, we're going to begin living, thinking, and seeing things as my power, my might, my beauty, my gold, my silver, my water, my children. It's my life. I can do what I want to. Moses and God had the foresight to warn the people that this could happen. And in the same breath, wanting to keep expectations clean and clear for God's people, he also shares with them what will happen if what could happen happens. Read with me, verse 19, same book and chapter. Then it shall be, if you by any means, again, this is underlined in my chapter in my Bible, if by any means forget the Lord your God and follow other gods. And I would even say this is my take. I think many of you might agree, but to forget God is to serve other gods. I really feel that way. If we profess to be followers of Jesus, followers of God, to forget him, again, not just the post-it note, but like to internally cease to acknowledge his existence, his hand in life and all of humanity, that is to serve other gods. And you and I may not be actively participating in a form of worship to an idol. It may be simply that we're trusting in ourselves more than God. Then it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. How? 20. As the nations which the Lord destroys before you, so you shall perish, or you shall get lost, or you shall go astray, or you shall be destroyed, because you would not be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God. For many, many, many years, these people had heard these teachings and these messages and these commands of God. This is how you should live your life. These are the ways and the things in which God is going to do for you and has done for you and will continue to do for you in the future. And you should respond in remembrance. Not just a remembrance like a post-it note, got to do that today. No, but a remembrance in spirit, in being, in acknowledging what all of that means. And there's been constant warning that, hey, this is a slippery slope and it could lead to destruction, but you could come to a place where you cease to acknowledge God's hand in your life. And it may start with like, I don't think it's him, but it will end with everything's about me, and ultimately it will end in our destruction. So sometimes we could read books like Jeremiah. We could read books like Lamentations. We could read books like Ezekiel. And we can wonder, man, God, you're coming in hot. It's kind of harsh. But what you and I may fail to remember or even know, and I'm hoping we're helping with some of this today, is like, this is not a one-time issue. They have been responsible for this understanding and this knowledge and the wisdom of God since before they got into the land. And it's come to a point where God is needing to execute on the warning he gave them since the beginning. The warning that he's been giving them for hundreds of years that this was going to happen. And so from chapters 5 through 20-ish, 24-ish, you and I would read of God extending, speaking to the captives in Babylon, the destruction that he's bringing to Jerusalem. And the effects, not only that it will have on the remaining people in Jerusalem, but the effects that it will have on them as they live out 70 years in captivity in Babylon. This is my hope and my take for us. That the same warning, the same words of wisdom that God gave his people in Deuteronomy 8, I believe is for you and I today. This challenge, not in a bad way, not in a harsh way, but in an encouraging way, that God is doing a lot for you. Whether you see it or not, there are a lot of things that God is putting together, pieces of the puzzle of your life, of your purpose, of your destiny. And yes, do we have a responsibility in this? Yeah. We need to not be lazy. We need to get off our butt. We need to use and execute with the skills and gifts that God has given us. And we need to trust that he is going to lead the way, pioneer, trailblaze for us. And we were going to thank him for everything he brings our way. We too, the warning is that we too can take God's grace, God's mercy, God's provisions, And if we aren't careful to really remember all of this is from him, then we too can make it about us. Then we too can find ourselves in a situation where we look back at the paycheck, at the title, at the house, at the car, at the girl, at the guy, at the kids, at whatever it is, and say, look what I did. I'm dope. And God says, if that's the way you want to live, that's fine. But it's not going to lead to life. It's not going to lead to joy. It's not going to lead to fulfillment. Haven, God had #neverforget before any society. It is vital, I believe, it is vital, Haven, that we engage in some form of regular practice of never forgetting. And my encouragement and my challenge to you as we close is that this idea of never forgetting would not just happen once or twice a week in a public gathering, but that it would be a rhythm and a practice of life, personally, individually, every day, can take place in a form of journaling. I used to keep a prayer journal for several years. And before I even got to the what I would consider the prayer part, more the asks and the requests of God, I would just stop and take a couple minutes just to list who God is in my life in that moment of my life. Like who he has been, what he was done, just to reposition, repurpose my heart and my mind, acknowledging how great God is. This is also the instruction that Jesus gives us in how to pray. You guys remember this? I'm sure you guys have said these prayers before, maybe on a sports court or field. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. You guys know what I'm talking about? That whole model of prayer, if you look at it, the whole first 2/3, at least half of it, has what? Has everything to do about remembering God. Has everything to do with positioning God as first a father, caring, loving, protector, provider. Position, sees everything, knows everything, has a better vantage point on my whole life and all of history than I could ever have. Right? Perfect, whole, hallowed, complete. Has everything to do with acknowledging, remembering who God is. So it might be through journaling, it might be through prayer, it might be through the reading of scripture. It is often in community that we remind each other of who God is. I need people in my life when I'm like down in the dumps, frustrated, maybe even discouraged by God himself, let alone my circumstances. I need loving and caring people in my life to step in and say, hey, Nathan, I hear you. That's the worst. That sucks, man. But don't forget, do you remember when you were here 3 years ago and what God did in that set of circumstances? Do you remember when you prayed that one thing 2 weeks ago and where God has brought you since that prayer? Like, we need people in our lives to help us to remember. And also in worship, which is how we're going to close our night tonight as Justin comes up. In song and declaration and meditation of who God is and what joy he brings. So Haven, can I close with this? Can I encourage us with this? Never stop taking the time to thank God for all he has done. Purpose time in your drive, in the morning, at night, whenever it is, to pause and remember. Not just in our brains intellectually remember, though that is valuable, but in our very being, remembering who God is and the events that he's allowed, caused, or showed up in our life that has shaped us into the men and women that we are and the men and the women that we are becoming. Let's never forget God. Let me pray. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your gentleness and constantly reminding us how it is to our benefit and for our value that we pause, that we consider, that we celebrate all the ways in which you've shown up in our lives. And so God, for some of us, we might be in a place where we've forgotten for some time, or we've only hung our hat on Sunday nights to be the place where we remember. And so for those of us that are there, God, I ask, would you forgive us? I'm sorry that I've made our relationship just like a once a week, hour and a half check-in. And Lord, for all of us, would you remind us? would we maybe repurpose certain spaces and places in our lives to be places of worship, to be places of prayer and remembrance? And would you receive from us tonight as we close our meditation, our celebration, our song of worship? We love you, Jesus.